Thank you for joining us this evening. It's nice to see a decent crowd despite some pretty bad weather out there. I'm Gavin Cleespy, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I want to welcome you to the final program in our Housing as History series. For those of you who've been following us, the previous 3 programs all looked at specific affordable housing locations in Boston, such as Orchard Gardens or Villa Victoria, while this program will be a broader look at lessons learned and the road ahead. If you missed our earliest programs, we did tape all of them, and they will be on our website eventually. We just have to deal with a couple copyright issues. Looking at a good number of unfamiliar faces, I'm going to guess that there might be some people here who are visiting MHS for the first time. For anyone who is new to the institution, I would like to extend a special welcome. We are an independent nonprofit library. We collect family papers, organizational records, and all sorts of different stuff that tell the story of America through a lens of Massachusetts history. We make all of our papers available to anyone who's interested in using them through our research room. That includes about 14 million manuscript pages and is really quite a remarkable collection, including the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents, among other things. We're also continuing to collect material up until the present day, and we make all of this available through our reading room to the public. We also offer programs for educators, programs for academics, and public programs such as this evening's. We do all of this thanks to the support of our members and donors, so if you enjoy this evening's program but you're not yet a supporter of MHS, I would encourage you to consider joining. Before I introduce our panelists this evening, I would like to extend a special thank you to the Mass Humanities and the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard for their organization's support of the project. This Housing as History program series has been nearly a year in the making and has relied heavily on the expertise of many people who have spent their careers or lives involved in public and affordable housing issues in Boston. There are too many to list by name, but they are included in the printed program. I would, however, like to give an extra acknowledgement to Lawrence Vale, who has been our project scholar for the series, and also MHS's own Sarah Bertulli, who has worked tirelessly on this project and often behind the scenes. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that we had planned to include Bill McGonigal on this panel. We were shocked and saddened by his sudden death. Though I did not know Bill personally, we had been in contact with him during the planning stages of this program, and he was generous with his time and knowledge as we could have asked. We are very grateful to Kate Bennett for agreeing to be a part of the program in his place. Tonight we have an amazing panel that will look at the future of affordable housing in Boston, taking stock of past lessons learned. There's more biographical information for each of our speakers in the program, but I'll give you a few highlights for each of the people on stage. Our discussion will be led by David Luberoff, not actually on our stage, but at the podium, who is the Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. He has been a lecturer on sociology at Harvard University, served as a senior project advisor to the Boston Area Research Initiative at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and was the Executive Director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is joined by Kate Bennett, who is second from the left, who is the acting administrator of the Boston Housing Authority. She oversees public housing and housing choice voucher programs that provide affordable housing for about 50,000 people both in and around the city of Boston. She has worked in affordable housing development, policy and planning for more than 25 years and holds a master's in city planning from MIT. Soni Gupta, just past her, is the Director of Neighborhood and Housing at the Boston Foundation, where she leads the development, implementation, and evaluation of one of the Foundation's major strategic priorities, addressing the need for affordable homes for the people of Greater Boston. She has more than 20 years' experience in the field of affordable housing and holds a master's in architecture from MIT. There might be a slight theme you'll notice here. Sandra Henriquez currently serves as the Executive Director of the Detroit Housing Commission. From 2009 to 2014, she held the role of Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing for the Department of Housing and Urban Development under President Obama. Before serving in the Obama administration, she worked in various capacities in affordable housing in Boston from 1977 through 2009, including being the administrator and CEO of the Boston Housing Authority for 13 years. And last but not least, Lawrence Vale is the Associate Dean of the MIT School of Architecture and Planning and a Ford Professor of Urban Design and Planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, which he headed from 2002 to 2009. He holds degrees from Amherst College, MIT, and Oxford University. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panel.
From about a year ago when several of us got the call about this really wonderful idea, and I really want to laud the Mass Historical Society for including things like public housing in its recent history of public housing in the purview of what it covers. Really, I think, speaks to a really fascinating vision of what an entity like this can be. As Gavin said, as many of you know from previous events, the first 3 sessions in this 4-part series looked at the incredibly rich history of affordable subsidized housing in Boston, and we came on that term in part because we were trying to capture both the history of public housing, the Boston Housing Authority, but also the wide range, particularly of nonprofit community development corporations that have sprung up in the city, and of course the significant changes in federal and to a certain extent state policy that spurred that, and so that's how we provide at least some housing. And then, as Gavin said, tonight we're gonna shift gears and look forward. We're gonna shift gears a little bit as well. Kate Bennett's going to give us a little bit of an overview presentation of kind of where the Boston Housing Authority has come from and some of its really exciting current initiatives. And then we're going to shift into more of a conversational mode. I'll start that with some questions to the panelists, hopefully given the incredible amount of knowledge and talent on the stage that they'll start to have a conversation without me. And then at a certain point, we will bring you as active participants into the conversation. My job is in part to leave some time for Q&A. My goal, or my charge, I think, is to wrap up the formal part of the program by 7:30. So if you're trying to figure out how much longer you should stay, know that as close to 7:30 as I can, we'll wrap this up. Many of us will be available to stay around if there's a conversation that really needs to continue. So let me kick off. We started way back in this series about a month or so ago, looking at the history of a few notable projects, Columbia Point and Commonwealth, where they came from and how they'd evolved. And so it's probably right to start here, Kate, by asking, can you give us a little bit of an overview of BHA's efforts and perhaps touch a little bit on how the history is informing what we've done and where you think BHA is going?
Good evening, everybody. Just to say briefly, obviously a little bittersweet sitting in for Bill tonight, an amazing public servant, and really the heart and soul and voice of public housing, both locally and nationally. But more apropos for tonight, he was really an incredible history buff, and having either lived or worked in public housing his entire life, he was an amazing reservoir of public housing history that he loved to share. And I personally have probably spent hundreds of hours listening to Bill wax historical, typically me standing there sweating over some urgent issue in the present, and Bill sort of needing to go back first to the 70s or 60s or 50s before he could kind of come and deal with the present. So anyway, I miss him a lot, but it's actually not Bill you have to blame for me being here. It's Sandy, because she hired me, so you can take it up with her afterwards. So anyway, David asked me to just spend a few minutes sort of talking about what's happened at BHA and kind of the changing nature of federal programs that fund our work. And so this will be brief, but I'm just going to run through a few slides in that regard. There's a lot happening at BHA, but I don't know how many of you really know us very well, so I'm just quickly ticking through some background here. We are the city's largest landlord. We're about the 6th largest housing authority in the country. We own and manage about 10,000 public housing units, really throughout almost every neighborhood of the city. We also administer about 14,000 vouchers, both mobile and project-based vouchers in the private sector. And so taken together, that's administering housing to about 9% of the city's population. You know, we have an important presence in the city, not just in the neighborhoods. We have over 800 employees, and so, you know, we're an important agency in town that way as well. We are consistently the most diverse census tracts throughout the city in terms of race and ethnicity. About 40% of our families do not speak English in the home, and so a lot of our work includes a really robust language access component in order to engage our families and our residents who are typically extremely low income, averaging about $15,000 per year in annual income. And although housing is the foundation of what we do, we're really working across a lot of other sectors as well, whether it be health or mental health or resident empowerment or youth initiatives or addiction and recovery. We're sort of working across all of those disciplines. We have sites throughout Boston. As I said, some cities have very concentrated neighborhoods of public housing. Boston is lucky to have a very nice spread geographically, including in some very high market neighborhoods. We also have a lot of different types of housing, which you can kind of see along the right bar, whether it's, you know, kind of typical 3-story brick walk-up family housing or townhouses. We have high-rise elderly buildings. We have newer mid-rises. And so there's a lot of different stock that we're managing. I can't go anywhere without this slide, unfortunately. It's, you know, it just sort of provides a little bit of the context that we're operating in as we try to preserve our housing. This, HUD determines every year what housing authorities need to operate their properties, and then Congress appropriates funding that never quite measures up to that determination by HUD. And we would even argue with HUD's formula on that score. But what you see here is just sort of the decades of cumulative underfunding to the tune of $100 million since 1994 of what you know, HUD has determined we need to operate our properties versus what we get. And so I think in terms of our preservation efforts, that's just an important background slide. You've spent some time on Hope 6. I'm not going to dwell on it. I think that one thing I wanted to say was that BHA was the first housing authority to get a Hope 6 award in the mid-90s for Mission, Maine, and that was quickly followed by another award for Orchard Park, which if some of you at least heard about in the presentation last week. And I think one of the key things about Hope 6, because this, you know, kind of carries through other programs that HUD subsequently issued, is there was an express goal within Hope 6 to eliminate 100,000 units of very distressed public housing, the most dysfunctional, kind of iconic public housing failures. Certainly Mission and Orchard fit that category. These were properties that the Housing Authority had lost control of, the police did not have control of. 70% of the families who were offered a unit at Mission, desperate for housing, chose to go to the bottom of the BHA's waiting list rather than take a unit at a property that was so notorious. And so, you know, the HUD wanted to, with this program, eliminate that sort of worst of the worst, but also invite in the private sector and really bring in private real estate standards, property management standards, private financing, and sort of try to address some of the dysfunction, both by by leveraging a different type of housing authority activity. And I just wanted to say quickly about, part of Sandy's legacy at BHA has really been, first of all, being the first administrator to come to BHA that had a professional property management background. And Sandy professionalized a lot of areas of BHA, but relative to redevelopment and Hope 6, she really understood, coming from the private sector, what it would take for BHA to partner successfully in these deals, to interact with developers and investors and lenders for the first time, and the skills and capacities we would have to build and the flexibility we would have to develop in order to do that. And so I think that Sandy really set in motion something that became a legacy at BHA of a nationally recognized development team currently under the direction of Joe Bamberg. And to her credit, we have built a very successful series of revitalization efforts. Kind of moving to more recent Hope 6 transformations, a lot of the worst sort of got addressed or was in the pipeline by the early 2000s. And HUD started making awards to properties like Washington Beach, Franklin Hill, Maverick at BHA. These were properties that were very distressed physically. They totally needed redevelopment. But the authority had control of the properties. They were functional communities. They were not, kind of at the level of dysfunction that those earlier Hope 6s were. And so Old Colony is another example of one of our last Hope 6 awards. And really with these later efforts, we began to there began to be some different themes, where the earlier themes were really about de-densification and mixing incomes. In these later efforts, we actually started to do more all-affordable redevelopment as a response to the growing affordable housing crisis, and not wanting to lose any hard unit on site to the market. We also started doing one-for-one replacement of every deeply affordable unit on site, whereas those earlier projects we had done project basing off-site of some of those units in order to de-densify the site. And so I think the program sort of morphed forward and eventually became the Choice Neighborhoods program around that time. There was a growing interest by HUD to expand the impact of its investment in with Hope 6 dollars, and they sort of morphed the program into Choice Neighborhoods, which is supposed to sort of be this integration of neighborhood, housing, and people. There was a feeling that under Hope 6 there had been a lot of great housing built, but there weren't perhaps as lasting impacts for residents and around the neighborhood. And so Choice was really intended to correct for that. And it also, I think, really, was an extension of HUD's move to really push housing authorities to partner and leverage resources outside of HUD. And so we got an award for Whittier Street. We are currently about to cut a ribbon on the first phase of on-site housing. We recently cut a ribbon on the first phase of off-site housing. But with this grant, we're also building a park. We're revitalizing the Ruggles Street corridor from Ruggles Station to Dudley Square. We're doing work in the schools. And, frankly, we're sort of out of our wheelhouse all over the place in terms of the expectations and requirements of Choice Neighborhoods. And so that's required very deep and broad partnerships. And, partnerships was certainly a theme in Hope 6, but I think it's been like exponentially increased with Choice Neighborhoods without additional resources. I just have to say. And I've just got 2 more slides. Rolling forward, the rental assistance demonstration was initiated in 2012. For people that don't know RAD, it's really taking a property out of the public housing program at HUD and moving it to either the Section 8 or multifamily program at HUD. And, you know, I think RAD was really a more open acknowledgement by HUD that the public housing portfolio nationally was just outsized for the political and financial support that could come to bear at HUD. And so HUD was more openly acknowledging that they wanted to move properties out of this system and provide tools to do that. And I think the RAD program, you know, has certainly some really great qualities, and we're using it. We are doing this deal here at West Newton, in the South End with EBA, the CDC in the South End. It's a historical renovation of townhouses. But it's very difficult in a high market city like Boston to utilize RAD, and so it's been a somewhat limited tool for us. We also have 2 projects that are integrating an unprecedented level of market housing in order to leverage the land value of sites that we have in high market neighborhoods in Charlestown and in South Boston. And here, really for the first time, we're tipping the percentage of market housing like way up. At Charlestown, it's about 1.6 to 1 market to affordable. In South Boston, it's closer to 2 or over 2 to 1. Market to affordable, and that's really an effort to just create revenues to preserve the deeply affordable units. And so we're looking forward to breaking ground on Charlestown towards the end of next year. Those earlier projects with a market component had more of like a 20 to 25% market component. Whittier, 50%, and now these are, you know, kind of a whole new ball game. And so lastly, just to say we've got about 4,000 units in this redevelopment pipeline that will come out of the public housing program and either be under BHA ownership but on a different subsidy platform or be with other private owners. And that number is also a legacy to Bill. I mean, Bill has been really relentless about finding solutions and public-private partnerships for our properties. We have 7,000 units remaining with about $1 billion in capital needs, and we continue to preserve them. We continue to develop plans to try to move some of them to RAD and project-based Section 8 and other platforms. Super challenging, though. Super challenging. The capital needs are just, you know, overwhelming. And then we're doing a lot of other things just to kind of, to pivot the agency for the businesses that we're in today that we're not necessarily really staffed for or addressing, and some significant systems changes. In terms of the broader city, landscape and the way in which, the kind of themes that I think are in play right now, and I know Soni's going to talk a little bit about broader city challenges, but just to say, kind of some of the ways in which we intersect with those is, first of all, what is the role of the city to step in for the federal government when the federal government isn't providing adequate funding? The city can't fully fill that gap. But our city has certainly been very generous and is doing everything it can. Mayor Walsh, Mayor Menino have both been incredible. We were just talking about this earlier. Incredible supporters of public housing. My colleagues nationally are very envious of the position BHA is in terms of the support, both financial, but from a policy perspective as well. But the city has a lot of other things to do. And so it does create tensions. One of the tensions is, kind of how much to preserve versus how much to create new supply. Preserving critical housing for us is obviously critical, but the city's growing and costs are, skyrocketing, and so it's important to create new supply as well, and with limited resources that gets, that there's a lot of tension there. There's a continuing debate, I think, internally at BHA every day, and I think around the city as well, about public versus private ownership and whether there remains a place for a public owner of affordable housing in the city, or whether it should sort of eventually all be moved to the private sector, and that's something we can talk about more if folks are interested. And then, lastly, I think it's just the city's changing rapidly, and there's an enormous effort going on at many levels in the nonprofit sector, through the foundations, through the city, to develop and preserve affordable housing. But the market is really formidable, and we have 47,000 families on our waiting list. And so how to keep seats at the table for Boston's low-income families, I think, is an increasingly urgent conversation. So that's something about what's going on at BHA.
Kate. Thank you for covering so much ground, and you really have set us up for I think a couple of the key themes that we want to explore. One being the kind of the rest of the landscape in Boston. The second being sort of where's Boston relative to other cities, and then what both of the answers to those questions I think suggest about needs and strategies for the future. And as it happens, we've got three experts who any one of whom could answer any of these. But starting, Soni, can you sort of fill out the landscape? Again, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Boston is somewhat interesting in that it's you have the housing authority, but then an amazing array of nonprofits and other actors trying to get their arms around this affordable housing situation. So can you give us sort of the rest of the picture?
Sure, I can try to do that. Thank you to thank you to Kate for an amazing run through of the work that the Boston Housing Authority does. It's a real ally in providing affordable housing in the city of Boston. And as Kate said, Boston does a lot, both with the city and the Housing Authority. And it's a bit of an anomaly in the region. I know I have a colleague here from Cambridge. I know Cambridge is trying to do a lot as well, but Boston in particular has been responsible for a lot of the affordable housing production in the region. So I'm from the Boston Foundation. We're the Greater Boston Community Foundation, and our goal is to extend justice and opportunity for all the residents of the Greater Boston area. Part of what we do is build the bridges between nonprofits to form partnerships and networks. And as I was telling Larry, I have the privilege of being able to do that when people from a whole range of interests and representation come to meet with us looking for ways to support their work. So I think I just want to lay out the groundwork that sort of forms the basis of a lot of the work that the Boston Foundation is currently taking on. And what's different today is the recognition and the acknowledgement that housing policy from the early 1900s perpetuated social and racial and socioeconomic disparities to this day. A lot of what we know about zoning regulations in the early 1900s has perpetuated these differences all the way to today, where we're seeing policies and programs like redlining, blockbusting, has led to the communities that have remained communities of color primarily and low income. And those communities are the ones that continue to face some of the pressures that we're seeing today. So if you look at the communities that we're looking that have facing the greatest pressures of rent increases, far greater than the median rent increases in the city of Boston, and also evictions. Some of you may have heard the story on BUR just a few days ago, where an MIT grad student found that, or documented that evictions in Roxbury are 1 in 10. So for every 10 rentals, there's 1 eviction filing, and in Beacon Hill, it's 1 in 100. So a lot of the 10 times sort of the magnitude. And one of the key factors in this rising awareness around housing disparities and disparities around race and wealth and income has been the publication of this book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein about 2 years ago, where he documented the history, the segregationist origins of zoning rules back to the 1920s. And he makes the case that we have a constitutional obligation to eliminate housing segregation established by zoning. So with that as sort of background, what we're doing in the city of Boston is focusing as a foundation on these communities of color, the lower income communities of color, and the pressures that they're facing, which if you start to look at evictions and the fact that longtime residents of these communities are now being forced out of their communities, we're focusing on the issue of displacement, the residential displacement, but also commercial displacement, where smaller businesses in many of these lower income communities can no longer remain viable. Some of the ways that the Boston Foundation is looking at displacement is just focusing on grassroots efforts, and many of these grassroots efforts are actually looking at zoning policies that are more local. So there's a group called Action for Equity that's pushing that's trying to get momentum behind something called, I'm trying to get the word terminology right, equitable transit-related zoning overlay district, where they're looking at the communities that are along transit lines. So if you look at the Fairmount line, which is actually a commuter rail, but it runs only within the city of Boston, that runs through Mattapan, Dorchester, Hyde Park, and there are a lot of communities of color that are lower income along this line. Those are the very communities that are seeing pressures of gentrification and displacement. And Action for Equity is trying to create a protection zone where any new affordable housing that would be built in that overlay district would include much more affordability. So 40% of those new developments would include affordability versus, say, what inclusionary zoning requires, that's 13%. There's a group called Green Roots in Chelsea that's working on an anti-displacement roundtable. They're actually come out of environmental justice, but housing is an environmental justice issue, and the roundtable is gathering multi-sector, cross-sector partners in their effort, where they're looking at preventing displacement both from housing development and climate along the waterfront in Chelsea, and also trying to build more affordable housing in any new development in Chelsea. We have a group that's called the Boston Tenant Coalition that's working on increasing what's called the inclusionary development policy in the city of Boston, and this is the policy that requires developers of private market housing to set aside a certain percentage of their units as affordable, and the Boston Tenant Coalition is trying to see if there's momentum behind increasing that percentage and also increasing affordability within that percentage, so deepening affordability so that lower income households can access those units. And that's sort of the anti-displacement frame that the Boston Foundation is looking at within the city of Boston. Parallel to that is a track on zoning reform, because along with what the city's been doing very well and with a focus on affordability, both with the BHA and the city administration, is the fact that a lot of the pressures on housing and the shortage of the housing supply is due to exclusionary zoning policies outside of the city of Boston. And so we're focusing on those, we're supporting the organizations that are working on being able to impact zoning reform both at the legislative level, so creating bills, of putting forward bills that would increase, that would allow the production of multifamily housing in the suburbs and along transit lines, including the commuter rail. We're also working with organizations that are looking to provide technical assistance and build capacity within municipalities who actually want to do more, but feel like they have been stymied by their own communities. And then also at the resident level, looking at what kinds of supports can be provided to the folks who believe in affordable housing and support it, but are often unable to show up at the meetings where it counts, like zoning meetings or planning board meetings, or when they do show up, they feel as if they do not have the power to speak up against the vastly larger number of people who typically show up against affordable housing. So we're working on those parallel tracks. You're all probably familiar with the immense shortage of housing. There are, the city of Boston has a plan to create 69,000 new affordable housing units. The state of Massachusetts has an affordable housing goal. The Metro Mayor's region, which are the 15 inner core communities, has an affordable housing goal. We're all looking at an extreme housing shortage that's been driven by a booming innovation economy. So I think what we're also learning is that we have to reach within each one of ourselves individually and personally and become the community organizer and the activist and show up in your community for all of the meetings that determine the fate of an affordable housing development, and use the power of your own voice as well. So I'll stop there.
When we were framing this conversation, one of the questions we had was not only kind of how the history informed Boston, but also how does Boston compare and our experiences with other major cities. So, you know, we obviously have an important story about Boston and the suburbs, and fortunately we identified two wonderful people who can help us both know Boston but also know the rest of the world, as it were. And I'll start with Sandra Henriquez. As you heard in Gavin's introduction, Sandra's both oversaw essentially all the public housing programs at HUD for 5 years, and then I don't know what drives one back to the public housing world, but somewhat to some people's surprise, took on the job as the head of the Detroit Housing Commission. And so I'm wondering, what does this look like from as you look at Boston, from both the perspective of Detroit and the perspective of Washington? What have we done well? What could we learn from others? How do we compare?
So I must admit, thank you very much for having me come to speak today, and it's good to be back in Boston. How does Boston compare? So I listened to the presentations before me, and I am sort of waxing, oh my gosh, how different it is. When I think about where Detroit is to where Boston is, I think there are very few cities across the landscape that are moving in this direction fast enough and have the same sorts of issues that Boston has been working on to overcome for years. And they're mostly cities where, indeed, you'll find that the real estate prices in the market is really hot. So you're looking at the Seattles, and you're looking at Washington, D.C., and you just go across the country that way and look in those high markets, Chicago, for example. And then there's Detroit. I want Detroit, when it grows up, to be where Boston is. That's my goal. And I say that because Detroit is 137 square miles of city, of land mass, and the city has spent about $250 million to demolish a lot of single-family homes, and is trying to pass a bond bill for an additional $250 million to finish the job. They created a land bank, a Detroit land bank, so that they could amass both vacant land and vacant properties. And at one point, that number was over 95,000 parcels of land that they're trying to figure out through abutters being able to get the deeds to properties next to them, particularly vacant land. How do they renovate and sell properties? In Detroit, you could buy a fairly solid brick structure, single-family home, for anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000. Put in another $40,000 or $50,000, build it out, and maybe think about selling it for $100,000. But that's the difference in terms of what's driving the market. So you fast forward then to the public housing operation, and you find that issues around capacity and issues around the quality of the stock and issues around, have people thought about what to do and how the housing authority relates to the city? And I sort of wax wistful because indeed, having had the opportunity to work with Tom Menino, who clearly understood why affordable housing was important. And I don't know if there are very many mayors around this nation still who understand what that means for his or her city. And then going to HUD and thinking about lessons learned in Boston around Hope 6, and then you get to Washington, we're starting to talk about the Choice Neighborhood Program and what that looks like, and how do you build out a net new community that's got the good bones and the good structure, and how do you knit new communities together out of that. And then you go to a place, again, like Detroit, where it's in its infancy, thinking about Hope 6, and they're just finishing. The way they did Hope 6 was, we're just finishing now the 9th phase of a Hope 6 development. You have 9 phases for this work. It's taken 15 years to get it done. So RAD is just a sort of distant dream, repositioning and what those mechanisms will look like, and there aren't enough resources because downtown Detroit's very hot. The neighborhoods, not so much. And Detroit is a city of single-family homes. So unless you're in a high-end downtown, midtown apartment building, everybody else lives in single-family housing that is not up to code, that may not be even registered with the city. And you start thinking about those kinds of influences, and you're trying to create a community around a public housing development. So we worried in Boston that Mission, Main, and Orchard was causing blight in the rest of the neighborhood, and so you do something to fix those up and you generate better housing stock around that community. In Detroit, there's no such thing. So while we might be in Detroit the better housing in a particular neighborhood, and I walk that housing and I think that would never survive in Seattle, in Boston, in Chicago. And so we're trying to elevate all of the standards there. This morning I was with Secretary Carson in Detroit with the voucher program, which was a very nice award for us. But it reminded me, and Kate's slide that shows the declining investment from the HUD budgets and their appropriations every year. The impact of that in Detroit, for example, was this is a housing authority that had 400 employees at its max. It's down to 130. Exactly. So, and the bulk of people who left the organization are the ones who are closest to delivering services to residents. They're the skilled trades, they're the building maintenance techs, those people who deliver the customer service and keep properties going. So when you think about that, it's not just how do we reposition the housing, it's then how do we take care of it. And I have said to everybody, I'm going to monetize everything. Everything is a cost. and the foundations are willing to spend tens of millions of dollars a year, and I want that money to come into that organization to help build it out, to build its capacity. There are issues of equity that are going on in the city of Detroit. The activists and the advocates there don't understand affordable housing issues, the regulatory environment, and so on. And so it's a learning curve for everybody, both at the city level and the advocacy level. And so it feels like we're at ground zero in Detroit, where I listen again and I think, I'd like to be back in Boston, because it makes it, because there's a critical mass of all of you who really want to move an agenda and work together collaboratively to make that happen. That makes, I think, Boston and a few other cities across this country unique, where from the HUD perspective, housing authorities are still fairly isolated, are trying to work to be more collaborative in their political landscape, but it's really a slog for them, and people believe that the resources don't need to happen because there still is a mistrust and distrust of how a public housing authority is going to operate. So that's where we are, and it's
nice to have you back temporarily.
so I'm going to look to Kate and then try and have her come to Detroit and talk to folks about why this is important and how to get there after the winter.
Larry, you've now for almost 20 years been chronicling kind of the unfolding saga of public housing. I was just looking here at the titles of your books, you know, the Puritans of Projects, then it was reclaiming public housing, and then it was purging the poorest, as in some of the writing about, particularly about Hope 6. But your new book, or your relatively new book, is After the Projects, Public Housing Redevelopment and the Governance of Poorest Americans. And so I'm wondering, you know, from that frame and from what you've heard here, under what circumstances could we be one could listen to this conversation and be modestly optimistic or incredibly pessimistic, and I'm wondering under what circumstances we could be thinking about this more optimistically, one more pessimistically, which is really a way of saying, what are you hearing in this conversation?
I mean, I think we'd probably have to ask me the question again in November 2020, and I might have a different answer for you. But I certainly think that we have good reason to be optimistic, especially in a place like Boston, where there has been a tradition for decades of just really high quality people in a lot of different sectors who care about this. And I mean not just the public sector, but the for-profit private sector, the not-for-profit communities and the sector, and the kinds of resident communities that in many cases have really taken both a combative but also ultimately protective and constructive approach to really caring about their communities, and that's been very encouraging to me. And I've been thinking not only about what I was hearing tonight, but more broadly about where this future takes us in trying to think about housing as history, our overall theme. And I think Soni earlier mentioned one of the key things in highlighting the Richard Rothstein book and the ways that certain kinds of policies have been implemented with one set of ideas decades ago that have come back to sustain certain kinds of segregation and certain patterns of land use. But I thought of another 6 lessons of history that kind of seem to be apparent in some of what we've heard in the first 3 programs as well as tonight. The first is that low-income people need and deserve affordable housing. And that may seem obvious, but what has been so interesting over the history is the contested nature of which of the poor people should be the beneficiaries of this thing called public housing. Should the role of the government, the state, be about rewarding a particular kind of poor person for particular kinds of upwardly mobile behavior? Should they have been required to have a job of a certain rent-paying stability? Should they have served the country as a veteran in wartime? Should they be on their way to home ownership and in the way that we reward subsidies for deductions on your property taxes and things like that? At least you used to, except in blue states. Where it's a challenge. Or should the government's role really be as a kind of coping mechanism for people, a safety net for people who are just not able to economically sustain themselves in the city where they find themselves, even when they're working, because things have gotten so expensive. So there's certainly a lot of, and increasingly in a city like Boston, need to think about housing affordability for the less poor, but it shouldn't happen at the expense of those who are really the poorest of the poor. And that means expanding the affordable housing pie, not just slicing it differently. The second thing that I think has come up as a term several times tonight and is always used often without pausing to say what we mean is this word affordability. So I would say affordability is a slippery concept. And it means that every time any of us here in the room hear somebody say that, we should be really ever vigilant about terms like affordable or public housing eligible or workforce housing, things like that, because they can be code words for targeting higher income people who might still be eligible for public housing because they would have the upper end of the income eligibility, but they're not the people on the waiting lists for public housing, for instance. And Boston is having to protect the permanently affordable stock, but it has to be ways that it has to be housing that is affordable, not simply to in that as a general term, but affordable to the families that really are those with the lowest incomes and meets the needs of them. So when Kate was talking, she was really careful about the language. She talked about an all affordable redevelopment. So I will hear that, and I'll hear, well, public housing and low income housing tax credits and things like that will get a range of people who have some kind of subsidy, but it won't be only the lowest income. Or there would be a phrase that Kate also used, deeply affordable. So when I hear that, I hear, okay, what she's saying is that's for people who have the kind of housing where they're only going to pay 30% of their income for that housing, and it's there. But lots of people who use the term less carefully than Kate did will make you think that it's serving one group when it's really not doing that. So the third thing from history that I think is apparent, and was particularly apparent in a couple of the second and the third sessions of this series for any of you who are able to get to those, is that community activism matters. It matters not only at the time, but it matters over decades. Boston has done much more than most American cities to preserve its public housing stock for low income and really the lowest income occupancy than most other cities, but the political pressure to do so is not a coincidence. This was the hard work of a lot of people over a lot of time, and I think it's rooted in a kind of backlash against the excesses of the earliest parts of urban renewal, the West End clearance, the New York streets clearance, the sense that if Ed Logue was going to talk about planning with people, he better be talking about planning with all the people and not just the most upwardly mobile homeowners in the neighborhoods that he was seeking to redevelopment. It's in turn what prompted a nationally enviable set of not-for-profit developers that emerge out of that urban renewal backlash, out of those opportunities that are being created in the 1970s. It's not a coincidence that the development of the urban renewal next to the Orchard Park, now Orchard Gardens, had the origins of the Madison Park Development Corporation that decades later becomes the not-for-profit partner in the redevelopment of Orchard Gardens. It's people that remember what had happened in those decades that were trying to do this. This is what's brought the not-for-profit organizations and the developers and organizations that know how to work with and respond to low-income residents when they're seeking not just new investment, but resistance to displacement. Fourth, I think one of the key stories of the Boston Housing Authority is that public sector reform is possible. The decline that happened in the Boston Housing Authority in the 1970s was a national extreme and an embarrassment. You know, when this agency went into receivership in 1980, this was the first public agency of its kind in the country to do that. Do not ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee in public housing, and yet the recovery of public housing in the Boston Housing Authority that started with the achievements of the receivership with Harry Spence and the amazing staff that rebuilt this. That's probably when you came on the scene at some point at the beginning in that era. And then it gets continued more recently with the leadership that Sandy Henriquez and then Bill McGonigal and now Kate Bennett have been doing it. It's now equally a nationally important success story to kind of see what had been really one of the country's most flawed and failed agencies to come back to a point where it really can serve, not perfectly, especially given all of those dire things we saw in the budget charts, but 9% of the city's population. That's a lot. It's a high number for a public housing agency to do. Fifth, I think we have to look at history and say that the trend line is still pretty dire looking. You know, after decades, if you start in the 1930s and you look at the investments that went on to build and invent deeply subsidized housing, the projects and then the voucher systems and all of that, where it was going up and up for decades, the last 20 years have really yielded a slow reversal in the numbers. And we're in a situation where far too many households are spending far too much of their income for rent and utilities in all sorts of ways. So the enhanced vouchers, the RAD program conversions are important ways of treading water. The inclusionary housing practices that we mentioned are certainly a necessary part and help a little, but we're losing ground. And then last, sixth, there is a renewed interest in thinking big. This is where I come out answering David's question most directly, I think. Whether we're talking about the housing component of the Green New Deal or other proposals by some in Congress to talk about funding the National Housing Trust Fund with tens of billions of dollars instead of 200 million per year where it is now. And that's money coming from outside of the HUD budget, which makes it easier because it comes through Treasury. And then there are all sorts of community-driven initiatives. In other words, I think there is some renewed energy out there in making affordable housing a high national priority in the way that it should be. Whether you want to frame it as a piece of infrastructure investment or a necessary component of an energy retrofit and an environmental safety measure in an era of increased climate chaos, the enhanced investment in housing for those who are least economically advantaged really seems more urgent than ever, and I hope that we can all become more optimistic that the necessary national commitment to that, given the talent in places like Boston, is something that can continue and really be something that we'll be able to look to in the years ahead of saying, yes, we're now taking that seriously.
Questions? I'd ask you to identify yourself and remind you that a question is a short statement that is a request for information or response. And we've got one here and then one here.
I'm Todd Larson. I'm a freelance writer and editor. To what extent do you think the abolition of rent control has exacerbated the affordable housing crisis or increased the production of housing? And would you consider it as an equation in the affordable housing, or as a factor in the affordable housing equation?
You're absolutely right in pointing that out. There is indeed renewed interest in rent control within certain communities for sure, as a way of stabilizing the residents that are feeling the pressures of displacement in particular. So City of Boston, Cambridge, there are definitely legislators as well as other elected officials and residents who are in favor of excuse me, rent control. For some communities, it's almost a way out of increased housing production. So communities are using the support of rent control as a way of stopping housing production in their particular neighborhoods, as a way of saying, well, here's how we can preserve affordability. Let's just institute rent control. We don't have to produce any more housing. Right now, though, the affordability crisis is being caused in great part by the sheer lack of housing. We're facing a housing crunch across all income levels, and we need to see an increase in market rate production of housing as well as affordable housing. So while rent control will help stabilize some of the households that are feeling rent pressures, it's not going to add to the stock of affordable housing. So I think it just needs to be considered in addition to all of the other measures that will actually give us more housing stock that's affordable. That's affordable to households at the lowest income of the spectrum.
Just to note that there's probably, at least among economists, there was an article many years ago that noted that this is probably the one thing that economists will all agree is a terrible idea. I think the last survey of American Economics Association, something like 92%. You can't even get 92% of economists to agree that today is Wednesday. The other thing that I think is striking is that three states have recently expanded rent control: New York, Oregon, and California. I don't know the details as well in New York, but the Oregon and California measures are very loose forms of rent control. Oregon, it's 7%. The limits rent increases to 7% above the rate of inflation. In California, it's 5% above the rate of inflation. So you could still see some fairly substantial growth. What you wouldn't see is the flip when rents triple in a really short time. So the politics of it, at least in other states, are proving to be appealing, but only to a point. I know there was a question up front here, and then there's two in the back. Yes, ma'am.
And I'm a member of the CDC. I went to a meeting last night. I'm also a Ward 4 member.
Which CDC?
Not with the Fenway CDC.
The Fenway CDC.
And to piggyback off of what you said about affordable and people who say it would slow the growth of apartments. It wouldn't. Why? Because the name of the game is that when you rent, no matter who you're renting to, it is perpetual money every month, not once a year or when you lose your job. It's constant money. You don't need to worry about a realtor who's constantly getting money per month. So how can it stop the growth of an apartment or a building? My question to you, though, is the accountability, not only for yourselves, but for our counselors that we are electing. For me, this personally seems like they could see this coming. And my meeting last night was saying that, well, the realtors hide behind the counselors, and the counselors hide behind the realtors. So they're feeding us a line, but yet they know what they're doing, you know? So how is it with you guys being Boston Public Housing? How can you attack this? How can we get in front of this to say, stop this BS? You know what you're doing. It's been in the works for a while. And displacement, where do these people go? We don't know if they left town, if they're with a relative, if they died, or anything. Displacement is something, and it's racist, to where it seems like you don't want anybody of color anywhere. It's either prison or death, you know? So it's a hardcore push, I would say, a hardcore intention to do this. And we need to stop it. So I was wondering, what do you think? Because, you know, among yourselves, among your friends, among your own, you would speak freely more about this. This is a personal thing.
Who wants to?
I would just say, first of all, that's a great question. I think these are you've cut to the crux of, I think, what the city is really struggling with, which is, you know, just how to stop this escalation and how to sort of lock down some preservation in the city. And I think it's very difficult. And just the one window on it that I would share from the Housing Authority's perspective is that our residents have become our higher income residents are increasingly unable to jump off of public housing into the private sector. And that's always been a challenge, but you know, we have families that are actually making the higher end of eligibility is 80% of area median income. You know, that's a working salary, and those families cannot find a unit to go to, so they stay in public housing. Our attrition is much lower than it used to be. For years and years and years when I came to the Housing Authority, our attrition rate was maybe 10% turnover a year. It's down to about 5 or 6%. I think there's just nowhere for people to go. And so I would just share that as an observation related to your question. I don't have an answer.
Anybody else want to?
Well, I think there's, again, the City of Boston has a program called the Acquisition Opportunity Program, where they have a pool of funds that's available for nonprofits to purchase occupied properties and take them off the speculative market. So really, you know, where the properties might be serving slightly lower income residents and is at risk of gentrification, where it could be bought up by a market, by somebody on the market and just flipped, and all of the residents would be displaced and evicted. That, in this kind of a hot market, that acquisition program just doesn't have the kind of funding that it needs. You need millions of dollars to be able to buy occupied properties, even the ones that are potentially a little less well maintained. But I think the city's, through that program, is attempting to do just that, which is prevent residents from being displaced and from properties from flipping. I mean, I think in an environment where we're just not building any more social housing, where public housing is really the only kind of social housing for the social benefit that is permanently protected from market forces. We do have to consider the the affordable housing stock that's owned by the housing authorities and also by the community development corporations and other nonprofits that are mission-based, where we know that at least in perpetuity, For the most part, those properties are protected, but how do we get more of them into the fold?
One thing to note, we at the Joint Center wade into Larry's definitional problems about affordability a lot, and we look at something like roughly half of all renters in the United States are paying at least 30% of their income for housing. About a quarter are paying 50% or more, which is astonishing when you think about it. When you look at that by income categories, poor people have always spent a large share of their income on housing. In a lot of the high-cost metros like Boston, increasingly it's people in the middle, so the 80% and even the 120% of median income folks. And that does seem to be changing the politics. If you look at sort of the sweep, the fact that housing is back on the agenda, the fact that presidential candidates are even talking about housing is really a change, and that's in part because the sort of spread of people who are concerned about it is much greater. Now, the trick, I think, as Larry really underscored, is making sure in whatever response comes that the folks who really need this the most don't get sort of pushed aside. I think I took that lesson correctly. Other questions? I think in the back. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Adam Goldstein. I work for a affordable housing developer and consultant in Boston. We deal a lot with the supply side subsidies, like 9% and things like that. One thing I don't know a lot about are mobile Section 8 vouchers, and was wondering if you all could talk a bit more about that and whether you see that as a serious tool for preserving affordability in Boston and elsewhere, and if not, if there are possible policy changes to make it one.
Stab at this first. There are several. Yeah, I was going to do that. There are several. So there's a voucher program, used to be called Section 8, it's now Housing Choice Vouchers, and there are several types. They operate the same way. You're income eligible, deeply affordable, 30% of your income you pay for rent, and the mobile ones are, the subsidy is attached to you as the voucher holder and allows you to go find a qualified unit. That means it has to pass an inspection, and then you can use that voucher in a privately owned apartment, house, whatever it is tied to the income level supported by that voucher, okay? And when you move from one place to another, you take your subsidy with you, unlike a hard unit where the subsidy is tied to the unit, and when you move out, you lose the subsidy because it stays tied to the unit. So mobile vouchers are generally seen as better, if you will, because you can get into the marketplace anywhere you want to go, and anywhere in the United States you can use your voucher to port from place to place. So you've got a greater mobility. You know that where you live is not in a public housing development where everybody would drive by and go, you live there, we know that you're low income. You really can blend much more, almost mainstream into the neighborhood and the community. There's also, though, a carve-out that you can do to project base a voucher. So a housing authority can take up to 20% of its vouchers and project base. That means that they actually tie the voucher to the hard unit, and therefore you can move in, you pay deeply affordable, you pay 30% of your adjusted income for rent, but when you go to vacate the unit where the voucher has been project-based, the voucher stays attached to the unit. A housing authority is required then to give you a mobile voucher so that you don't lose your affordability and you don't lose your ability to go elsewhere should you choose to do that. And then in addition, there are a variety of what they call special purpose vouchers, which go to to supporting deeply affordable units for special populations, family unification, so that families can be together if the kids have been in foster care for some reason, and now parents get their children back to create a whole unit. Mainstream vouchers for people who are non-elderly disabled, whether physically or developmentally delayed or with mental health disabilities. We have a variety of those. VASH vouchers for veterans tied to decreasing homelessness among the veteran population. So they all work the same way. It's just what the target population may be and how you can then use them in the marketplace. A lot of times people will do an affordable development using low-income housing tax credits because that has a level of affordability that is not deeply affordable. And so sometimes you'll partner those with project-based vouchers to get the 30% of area median income payments for people as well.
I would just add a couple of things to that, and that is that if you look around the country, and I assume it's probably similar in Boston, it's about 1 in 4 of the income eligible households that actually get one of these vouchers. So, we have a shortage of the potential supply, that it's not a completely unimaginable number to do more of this. But it's also has to be coupled with a reality check about whether there are landlords and places for people to be able to deploy those vouchers if we were to do it, which gets us back into one of the reasons why history matters to this, and that is that there is a history of systemic racism and various forms of prejudices and assumptions that are made unfairly about households. And so as good as it is to think about having more of these vouchers and finding ways of Congress to allocate those funds, it comes back to how people in cities are going to behave and react in the private market. And one of the reasons why the public sector has been so important to keep in mind is that the private sector behavior in many cases has been less than accommodating, literally and figuratively in these kinds of things. The other thing I would say about vouchers is that I think has been interesting is that they're increasingly interesting and effective ways of trying to help people maximize the range of places that they might be able to deploy that voucher, either by changing the way we calculate what a fair market rent would be, where you could deploy your voucher in some place that you might initially think was expensive because it's all based on the Boston area as a whole. But if you had these more targeted districts, as has been starting to be deployed, where you could reach neighborhoods that would give you a higher amount of allowance to deploy a voucher in a more expensive place, that could help. But that needs to be coupled with something that is also being developed in partnerships with the Boston Housing Authority. One of my doctoral students has been working with them closely on this, and it's really trying to figure out how can you help people be informed about the range of neighborhoods that might be the right place for them. If you could input the things that you care most about, it might yield places that would be both affordable to you with your voucher, but also meet certain needs to be near people or near jobs or near transit or near all sorts of things. And that the more informed that people can get about the range of places, the more likely that they could use more of the city and even beyond the city with those vouchers that they've been lucky to get.
I think we have time.
Okay, was gonna,
Oh, I'm sorry. No, go ahead, Kit. I'm sorry. I didn't think. What happens when they throw me over here in the corner?
Just to echo, we're very excited about that the majority of our voucher holders go to Roxbury and Dorchester, and there's a number of reasons for that, and we want to help people make the choices that they want to make. But at the same time, as Larry notes, there's a lot of work to be done to open up other neighborhoods within Boston as well as in the suburbs to families, and we're really excited about this initiative to try to not only work with families to expand their understanding of their choices, but also do that work with property owners and landlords in those neighborhoods. It's critical to create that supply.
We have time for one more question.
I got the mic,
yep,
too.
And I see who's already got
So
it.
whoever wants
Owen.
that question, I got. Hi, I'm Alexander von Hoffman, and I'm at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. I've been looking at housing history for a long time. And I want to ask you a question that 20, 30 years ago, before Sandra Henriquez got involved, nobody would have asked. But is there a potential now, and I'm listening to Kate and some of the things you're doing at BHA, for public housing authorities to become entrepreneurial, innovative centers? Because as we face this problem of wealthy people flooding into the cities and pumping up the prices, and immigrants coming in, all sorts of different problems, we need agencies on the ground. As they say, 30 years ago, nobody would have thought a public housing authority had the ability to get out of its rigid little box that it was in. But that's my question. And I'm just to throw out cross subsidies. It's kind of the stuff you're doing where you get, market rate, but you're getting the revenue, or other things that I can't even imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the vision for us, certainly at BHA, and I think there's a number of sort of entrepreneurial and innovative things that we've done, but I think there's definitely a lot more that we could do. I think partly what I see ahead for me is kind of, as I talked a little bit about, just kind of repositioning the agency for that business, the business of being the housing authority of the future, where we are in, for instance, a much more of an asset management role to a lot of properties. We're not owning and managing as many properties, but we haven't really developed the internal capacities and systems to do that well yet. And so I think we need to be as entrepreneurial as we can, but we also need to, at the same time, bring the agency forward, for that capacity. And it's not always fast work.
I would add that I think it's out of necessity that housing authorities have to think about becoming something different. Some housing authorities have changed their names to get away already from the, I'll use air quotes, stigma of being a public housing authority. If you can, I go back to the graph, the chart that Kate put up about the declining subsidy. We need to develop different and diverse lines of business just as a safeguard so that we can continue to meet the mission. And without that, we will continue to lose units and lose deeply affordable units wherever those units are located. And we have to, and I think that out of necessity, we will continue to be more innovative just for our own survival. Detroit did a land deal. I was able to ink the deal, but that had been in the works for about 18 months. So we're now sitting on about $19 million. And so the thing is what to do with that. And so I just looked at a prospectus with my board chair. We might spend $2 million to buy an 80-unit property that has a range of affordability from 30% to 60%, as a way to defederalize some of our money, so that if we look at the cash flow, how do we do that? Housing authorities, public housing was the only real estate that I know of in the world that operated with not real estate principles and practices. You got a grant to build it, whether you built it like Boston all over the city, or in some places it's on the other side or the wrong side of the tracks, but however it got built, it was done by a grant. And then allegedly, over time, you were supposed to have, the feds would make up the difference in terms of what you needed to operate it. it became more expensive to operate. And as it became more expensive, the political will to support it vanished. And so now we all suffer the vagaries of appropriations. And we will continue to do that until we can figure out how to do something different. RAD puts it on another platform simply because it changes it to a Section 8 platform where all the multifamily owners, where there's mortgage paper and there are mortgages to be paid, it puts it in that world. That world, therefore, because there's so much paper, you'll have other people, other voices supporting having the political will to make sure that the money is there to support the operations. You don't see the kind of deep cuts on the multifamily side that you see on the public housing side. So if we join that side of the world, we may be in a better position for the longer term. We will also be able then to operate our property the way it's supposed to be. You get a mortgage, you pull out the equity, you invest it back in your property, you figure out your useful lives, you keep maintaining, upgrading, and so on, and then you refinance, and you do the same thing all over again. That's how the world works, except public housing never did, and now we have a chance to do that. That, I think, is a game changer for us. And whether we continue to own it, or own the land, or somehow it's privately managed, or we don't own it, but we get an asset management fee, again, some cash out of the deal on an ongoing basis, another line of business for us. I think we have to think about all of that stuff, and all of that makes sense, and that's what's going to be important for deeply affordable properties to continue to exist.
Unfortunately, we did promise to get you out of here at 7:30. The panelists and I will stay around, so if you do have that pressing question, please do grab us, but I want to respect time. I'm really an extraordinary conversation, and thinking about it as I've been sitting up here. You know, the old saw and the wise saw that the test of a just society is how it treats the least among us. Public housing and you know, varying forms of subsidized affordable housing really are about, you know, on a cold, rainy night like this, that people should have a safe and decent and affordable place to live, and that they're not spending all of their money on it. As Matt Desmond has taught us, housing eats first. So if people who are spending too much on housing aren't going to be spending enough money on food or their children or health care. I think the panelists have underscored for us that there are an incredibly rich array of ways that we can do that, from a pure public housing model to where Sandy just was, of this making public housing look a little bit more like the rest of the real estate sector. And Larry's and Soni's kind of underscoring of the roles of community activists in making sure that things are done right, and it was really heartening to hear the sort of praise for the public sector. I think this has been an interesting week for those of us who care about things like public service, and being reminded at the very most broadest scales of what that looks like, and at the very local scale of you know, really underscoring that it is public institutions can and should function. And this is an ever-changing world. One thing sounds like we can be sure about is that if we come back here in 10 years, if the Historical Society will have us back, that Boston will have been probably a real leader in whatever happens. And perhaps by then Detroit will have been, actually we know Detroit will have been as well.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yeah. So please join me in thanking the panel and thanking Mass Historical Society.